ERP Misconceptions and Solutions, March 4, 2020. I wanted to create a very shorter narration that will encourage the listener to listen to my longer narrations from start to finish because they offer some very helpful information on the topic of OCD and the effectiveness of ERP that I'd hate to see overlooked. I want to keep this narration to 5 pages of text so as to keep the narration time limited to 15–20 minutes. I also want to hook the listener by sharing some very big misconceptions that often come from the medical community and are a consequence of poor reasoning on the behalf. I will itemize each misconception in a short enumerated sections, so let us begin. 1. I often hear that the individual with OCD is often described as behaving in an irrational manner. Is this true? No, not really. There are 2 forms of the meaning of irrational, where one means objectively invalid and the other means subjectively invalid. Often due to being so closely bound to one's emotional lens, one cannot distinguish one from the other, and one often thinks they are speaking in an objective manner but they are not. For example, it's true the statement, "Scratching at the lid of a casket when buried alive will release you from being buried alive," is an irrational statement. However, given you are indeed buried alive and scratching at the casket lid in an effort to release yourself, what you're doing is not objectively irrational at all. Why? There is nothing objectively invalid about doing this, and as a matter of fact, if evolution designed you to behave this way under the circumstances, then you are behaving in a precisely valid manner with respect to your biological assembly. Why then do people say such behavior is irrational? Simply stated, the faculty for emotion is opposed to acting in a manner or putting in place an act that does not coincide with providing the intended aim. If one is not aware that the notion of irrational is due to their emotive mind, then they think irrational is being directed at its target in an objective sense, but it is actually them who are lacking the insight to see the error of the reasoning. Incidentally, each of the following all have one thing in common. 1. You are scratching at a casket lid while buried alive. 2. You are washing your hands countless times to rid apparent possibility of contamination. 3. You are making an invalid statement to the Gestapo agent pointing a pistol at your head asking if you're a spy. What is this common feature held by all? You are performing each act because at the moment you have no other viable alternative, and at least the act allows you to have hope and give yourself a semblance of hope where despair is the only alternative. With the preceding in mind, would you even call any of the behaviors irrational in a subjective sense? I would not. I would not even call the fear of non-poisonous snakes irrational in a subjective sense. Why not? Because evolution is smarter than want to be human designers by knowing that the human mind cannot process snake identification quickly enough, hence, the better scheme for promoting survive to copy is to hardwire all fear of snakes. 2. I often hear the individual having OCD is lacking insight. Is this true? Almost surely this is not the case. Then why are they saying this? Almost surely because they are not seeing idiosyncratic emotive differences as what they are, where what they are is subjective differences. For example, what resonates emotively with you as a strong aversion can be very different from what resonates with me as a very strong emotive aversion. Actually, the medical community as a whole in the past is very guilty of being unaware of subjective idiosyncratic differences, and this is the reason that they had homosexuality as a disease and then disorder even as late as the 1990s. Honestly, I am not certain if as a group they have ever realized that they are not performing objective science when they are contaminating the conclusions with subjective evaluations, and I find this disturbing because it turns science into interior decorating. If you want to clearly see subjective idiosyncratic differences, then think of the straight women and the lesbian. Each has an aversion to the other's sexual preference but not to their own sexual preference. If you want an example of another kind, then think of those that have a fear of flying in an airplane. I can tell you as a mathematician that has a graduate degree specialization in probability theory that there is no such thing as the probability at which it is objectively irrational to choose to not fly on a plane. That notion is ridiculous, absurd and as invalid as 5 plus 3 equals 2. So, why are people making the claim? Again, they are letting the faculty for emotion determine what for them is reasonable and claiming that which does not coincide with their emotive mind as either lacking insight or as being irrational. Those saying one who fears to fly in an airplane is lacking insight or is behaving in an irrational manner makes me think of a transformed line from perhaps Hamlet where it is, methinks they forgot to ask for brains or were glued to their emotional lens at birth. Lastly, on the subject of insight is the following: given you and I have the same information and you accept some conclusion as valid while I do not and consider neither valid nor invalid has been ruled out does not mean I lack insight. Rather it means because assumptions were used in the process of arriving at your conclusion I am not in emotive agreement with accepting the conclusion as valid. On the other hand, you are in emotive agreement with accepting the conclusion as valid. As a guy with a graduate degree in mathematics, I can tell you no proof is without at least one underlying assumption, and this is why the conclusion of true or false always resolves to a matter of acceptance on one's behalf, and this can only be due to a strong attraction, much like dating the cute girl or boy. Thus ultimately acceptance of a conclusion also necessarily must be subjective too. Hence, it's not a lack of insight as claimed, rather, it is a matter of an emotive difference regarding what is sufficient for accepting as invalid, and the greater the emotive impact the more is needed to have acceptance. 3. I have seen it stated that ERP must always work, and it suggested that lack of insight, malingering, poor therapist etc. are the cause of when it fails without even one mention of it cannot be successful in all cases. Why? Apparently because the maker of the claim never thought it through at a depth of understanding that was other than superficial. For a good understanding of when ERP can succeed and otherwise almost surely must fail, please listen to my narration titled, Am I Better? Final version, but in the meantime I will give a short but lossy explanation. ERP should be expected to work only when the feared effect of the trigger is made demonstrable by the cause, such as a fear of a dog bite is made demonstrably false with respect to occurring when one has been exposed to the dog. Not all triggers have the feared effect associated with the trigger be made demonstrably false by the cause where the cause is the trigger. For example, let women are inferior to men taken as true like k is taken as an even integer, be the trigger. Suppose Sarah encounters the trigger. The effect here is not a natural consequence similar to the dog either bites or does not bite, rather, the effect is a question. The question is the trigger, true or false. At this point there are three perceptions with respect to the trigger that can be had by Sarah. If Sarah cannot rule out the trigger as being either true or false, then to Sarah the effect of the trigger has taken on the form of what I call an apparent possibility for either of the two options being valid. Specifically, the apparent possibility of the trigger being true will more than likely provoke a strong fear, since more than likely Sarah has a strong aversion to the notion that women are inferior to men. Here, unlike the dog bite, no amount of exposure to the darn trigger will disarm the trigger from generating a downstream fear any more than exposure to staring at 4172 will demonstrate it is the product of 69 squared is false. 4. In this section I want to give the listener a better way of envisioning the objects around us that trigger fear. It is a good idea to think of the actual objects in our environment as the actor on the stage and the character the actor is playing as the perception we have of the actual object in our environment. Like the play, where it is not actually the actor triggering the emotive response, rather, it is the character for us that triggers our emotions, it is also not really the actual object that is triggering our emotive response, rather, it is our perception of the actual object that triggers the emotive response. Recognizing this helps you get better and sometimes easily. What do I mean? Let's look at Sarah's case, and for brevity I will call women are inferior to men. Concept A. From here on, concept A can be perceived three ways, such as 1. Concept A is valid. 2. Concept A is invalid. 3. Concept A is either true or false and an apparent possibility that we all treat as a possibility regardless if later it turns up to be only imagined. There is no amount of exposure to the perception of concept A, seen as in item 3, that will cause fear over the prospect of being true to attenuate. However, if we changed our perception of the actual object, which here is concept A, to that seen in item 2, then fear evaporates immediately. How do we do this? Not exposure for sure, but through belief, and it will set you free. Hence, the key to succeeding with response prevention when ERP is almost surely bound to fail is to use belief or denial to change one's perception, which in a very real sense is changing the actual object itself. As a last example of using the tool of belief or denial, let's think of this. Suppose Sarah is married and the concept of infidelity on the part of her husband is an issue, or maybe the concept that her husband is an addicted gambler is the issue. Guess what? In this example, Sarah has such a strong enough aversion to these concepts that she has one or both as an OCD trigger. We can't change our emotive responses seen as aversions to our perceptions any more than changing the smell of sewage and decomposing bodies from horrible to good. It may seem that we do, but, if so, we have actually changed our perception of the object, not our emotive response to our perception. So, what can Sarah do? Live with the OCD trigger until? No, Sarah needs to change her perception from each is a possibility to each is not true and not possible, in spite of appearing as a possibility, and when this occurs, Sarah has disarmed the trigger. 5. My final caveat is, if you have not done so, change the meaning of possible and possibility so that it is not as commonly used where anything is possible because real is not being required. I actually wrote a paper on how possibility and possible were so poorly defined. As a mathematician in that specific field, I actually use the following definitions. I use them because under my definitions anything is not possible, rather anything can be imagined as possible. The common meaning is also problematic because it hides the existence of apparent possibility, and that needs to be clearly seen so that when you are believing in what is needed, the notion of possible is not contradicting your belief. Definitions. Let alpha be any event. Possible. 1. Alpha is free to be and free not to be where real is required. This meaning is objective. Possible. 2. Alpha exists as realized and not realized, but regardless of status, alpha retains a real capability to have a change to the other status. i.e., alpha is a real potential. This meaning is objective. Possible. 3. Alpha exists as being real where this state of being is unknown to the observer. This meaning is subjective since unknown, when given real, is due to the mind of the observer. Please note. All three meanings can appear to any animal or observer as being the case or capable of being the case when in fact being the case is not true or valid. Many things seen as possibilities are just apparent possibilities, and we who see as apparent cannot distinguish which is the case. All three meanings avoid what I see as an error that allows anything to be a possibility by each requiring real either for being free to be and not to be, or as a potential, or as existing. End. Footnote. I have a graduate degree in mathematics with specialty in probability and classical statistics, not in any social science including psychology. However, the body of this and other narrations I have created has been the product of a mathematician's training in reasoning applied to my 45 years of having OCD, which essentially provided the data that was analyzed. Had I not been afraid to delve deeply into applying reasoning to OCD as a topic because of being afraid of actually triggering the relentless pursuit of removing the troubling issue, I suspect I would have been better years ago. I wrote this and the other narrations because I can't bear to see people suffer from it, and please listen to my other narrations found on this very same channel, where I highly recommend first peeking at Am I Better final version. I aim to keep this narration short, so I did not address OCD connected to scruples. I found that it, which was my biggest trigger, completely vanished when I showed that views such as bad, wrong, unworthy, were strictly subjective by being emotive attitudes as opposed to objective or constituent parts of the object the attitude was directed at. Once you realize this, then both bad and not bad, where bad is a real objective attribute of an object, are imaginary, and the fear of being completely vanishes. More on scruples-based OCD can be seen in the narration, My Solution, which also is on this YouTube channel. Thanks for listening. Michael Boyer.